There's a trend in modern media that, while not exactly a new phenomenon, seems to have exploded in popularity as of recent, and that is the trend of subverting expectations for the sake of shock value and realism. Whether it's killing off a beloved protagonist, showing a villain victorious, or revealing that a supposed good guy was actually a bad guy, there's no denying that more and more media is starting to introduce sudden plot twists to surprise the audience and convince them to keep watching. As I've said, plenty of movies and media have done this in the past, but when it comes to why there's suddenly an immense desire for it nowadays, well, I think there's one specific show that can take most of the blame for that. Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones was a HBO fantasy series that was generally regarded as well written and well acted, up to a point. There's a lot to be said about how much influence it's had on current media, from convincing folks that the fantasy genre can be serious and sophisticated, to proving you can make a successful TV series with the budget of a blockbuster movie. But today, we are, of course, going to be talking about how it popularised subverted expectation. At the height of its popularity, the most popular joke to make in relation to this series was pretty much that if you have a favourite character, then they are almost certainly going to die. Everyone just dies on Game of Thrones. No one is safe.
Remember Ned Stark, he was a lot of fun, but he didn't make it past Season 1. Robert Baratheon was part of that crew, but he never made it to Season 2.
And this is one of the things that made the show as popular as it was. While the first season was generally well regarded, there's no denying that the moment the audience was well and truly gripped was the ending of the 9th episode, Baelor, wherein Ned Stark, the closest thing the show had to a main protagonist at that point, is executed on screen. The audiences at home, at least those unfamiliar with the source material, were stunned. Our main hero was dead. The despicable villain was victorious. This wasn't the way it was meant to go, and yet that's what happened. And so people were intrigued. This was not a show that was going to present a typical good guy takes out big evil villain story that we've seen 100 times. This was a show where anything could happen. Now, here's the thing about popular trends. Quite often, when a new piece of media sets the world alight by doing something different, there will be people looking to capitalise on that popularity. Unfortunately, sometimes the other creators jumping on the bandwagon simply think that using the new tool is all they need for success, without stopping to consider how to use the new tool. When you're only looking at the absolute surface level of what makes the new media successful, then often you aren't going to be able to properly replicate it. And when it comes to media that tried and failed to recreate Game of Thrones' success in subverted expectations, I think it's safe to say the award for the one that did this in the most controversial and rage-inducing way possible was Game of Thrones itself. Game of Thrones Season 8 caused a massive fan backlash. People did not appreciate the series ending with the biggest plot being dropped in episode 3, while the following episodes featured some of the most beloved characters suddenly switching gears and making completely illogical decisions for the most inconceivable reasons. Season 8 was still subverting expectations, but now these subversions were being met with anger rather than intrigue. Why was this? How come we were rejecting the very thing that made Game of Thrones such a hit in the first place? Well, 2 reasons. For starters, at this point we'd kind of come to expect the unexpected with Game of Thrones. The series had swerved us around so much that we were kinda used to it. In other words, you can't really subvert our expectations when subversions are expected. The second reason is, of course, that, unlike previous seasons, Season 8 was being written with no input from George R.R. Martin or his source material. Season 8 wasn't the first season to do this. The split sort of happened around Season 5. While Season 6 was actually pretty good, Season 7 showed a lot of cracks but otherwise wasn't hated, but Season 8 was where the writers truly dropped the ball. The thing is, the writers of the TV series were not the ones who came up with Game of Thrones' story and its subversive nature. That was George R.R. Martin. They merely adapted it into a television script. Because of this, in some ways, they were no different to the previously mentioned writers jumping on the bandwagon of the original show's success. They figured that since the subversive methods had worked before, they should just keep doing that, without stopping to consider why they had worked. Which still begs the question, exactly why did Ned Stark's execution work while, say, Daenerys' descent into darkness didn't? Well, here's the thing. Ned Stark's death makes sense. Let me explain. Ned Stark's biggest character flaw is that he has a serious case of honor before reason. Throughout the season, he gradually discovers that King Robert's children aren't actually his, but are rather the product of an affair between Queen Cersei Lannister and her brother, and as a result, Stannis Baratheon is the rightful heir to the throne. Now, because Ned always puts honor and the law first, he makes several mistakes because of it, such as warning Cersei that he's going to expose her, and alienating important allies by insisting that the wildly unpopular Stannis should be king. On top of this, we have seen that the Lannisters very much demand vengeance when they feel slighted, even when that vengeance is illogical, such as when Lady the Direwolf is killed as punishment for Nymeria biting Joffrey. In other words, everything that leads up to this moment suggests that Ned Stark is not going to get out of this situation intact. The only reason we expect him to is because, well, that's what usually happens in these stories, right? Except no, here it doesn't happen. There is no plot armor. There is no Deus Ex Machina. Ned Stark is killed because his actions had consequences. His actions were believable and in character. Yes, it was honourable and kind of him to give Cersei a chance to escape, but it was a huge mistake that led to the Lannisters biting back. Ned died because he made terrible choices, and so, by all accounts, his death actually shouldn't be that surprising. This was a sign to the people watching the show that, no, they weren't going to have to repeatedly suspend their disbelief when characters showed their plot armor, because there was very little plot armor. Characters, both good and bad, would face the consequences of their actions. Sometimes they'd escape, and sometimes they wouldn't. It wasn't just a case of, hey look, the heroes are losing and the villains are winning, isn't that subversive? It was a case of both the heroes and the villains are playing a dangerous game, and we're not going to protect them simply for the sake of the plot. In fact, in many cases, surprise moments like character deaths would lead to major changes in the plot, making the story nicely unpredictable. Subversions should be about taking apart bad, predictable tropes and cliches, not about one-upping the audience. That way, audiences will find it a refreshing change rather than feeling like fools for trusting where the story appeared to be going. And speaking of which, let's compare Season 8. Here, it's not a matter of consequences or the removal of plot armor, and it's certainly not a matter of realistic character decisions driving the plot. In Season 8, things just happen. Like, Euron Greyjoy suddenly becomes the greatest marksman in all of existence, and also seems to have completely maxed out his stealth stat, and he's able to shoot down Daenerys' dragon. Is this realistic? No. The writers argue that Daenerys kind of forgot about the Iron Fleet, even though they clearly mentioned them in a previous scene, but that's just ridiculous. While Euron has not established himself as a magical master marksman, he has clearly established himself as a threat to anyone travelling on the seas. The characters should all know this. See, this isn't a case of actions have consequences. This is a case of Daenerys is looking too OP right now, but that's going to make the Battle of King's Landing too lopsided and predictable, so let's kill a dragon. That'll shock the audience. Ultimately, it was not Euron who killed Rhaegal, it was the writers, because the lead up to the battle was simply too predictable. And rather than fix that with clever writing, they decided to just shove in a magic arrow and call it a day. After all, people like Game of Thrones to be realistic, and suggesting that at this point, Cersei could put any sort of fight up against Daenerys is unrealistic. So let's make it realistic by sacrificing realism and having Rhaegal killed in the most contrived way possible. And this brings me to, without a doubt, one of the most despised moments of the series. Daenerys wins the Battle of King's Landing, and then for no reason flips out and kills everyone. This scene makes no sense. Daenerys had already won. Daenerys had Cersei right where she wanted her. Daenerys, throughout the seasons, has only ever killed people she saw as oppressive or as a threat she couldn't ignore. Not only that, but her entire goal has always been to free people from oppressive tyrants. So why is she suddenly burning innocent civilians? The answer is because we don't expect it to happen. Just like we didn't expect Ned Stark to die. We all loved that plot point, right? So why don't we love this plot point? Well, as I've said, Ned Stark's death made sense. Ned Stark's death was much more than just an attempt to shock the audience. Ned Stark's death didn't feel like it was poking me in the face, saying, "Surprised yet? Are you shocked? Wasn't that unexpected?" Ned Stark's death was a case of an author looking at the typical contrived get-out-of-jail-free tropes found in so many stories and tossing them aside in the name of actual realism. For that reason, it feels like the story is respecting its audience. After all, the story isn't expecting us to suspend our disbelief and choose to believe that Ned Stark can just get out of this after everything, or that a spoilt brat like Joffrey will turn out to be a decent person after all. Daenerys' heel turn isn't respecting the audience. It's practically trying to say, "Gotcha! Did you like Daenerys? Well, wasn't that stupid of you?" Except it hasn't earned that gotcha. Daenerys up to this point has been a morally grey character, but she wasn't a genocidal monster. Of course we're shocked, because this goes against all logic. This is not in character for Daenerys. It's a subversion for the sake of being a subversion. Because if Daenerys had won and had become queen by dethroning Cersei and then had married Jon and lived happily ever after, well, that would have been a happy ending, and happy endings are just too mainstream. But you know what? Ironically, at this point, the most subversive ending Game of Thrones could have had is a happy ending. The show has absolutely thrived on being gritty, realistic, and miserable. We've come to expect that. Despite what the writers may have thought, some people did expect Daenerys to turn evil. Some people may have expected Jon Snow to turn evil. Some probably expected the show would just end with the Night King sitting on the throne. Who honestly expected the show to have a nice, bright, sunshiny ending? Would that have been a good ending? Not necessarily, and I'll tell you why. Because just subverting expectations for the sake of shock value does not automatically equal good writing. The purpose of subverting expectations should be to take apart overused tropes. Overused tropes like plot armor or Deus Ex Machinas. Overused tropes that make a series cliché and predictable. But at this point, Game of Thrones' use of subverted expectations have become a crutch. An excuse to botch the writing. An excuse to get from point A to point B in the laziest way possible while still trying to make it seem like they've done a good job. But the truth is, just because writing is unpredictable doesn't mean it's good. I could decide right now to turn this review around and say, psych, actually season 8 was great and you suck if you think otherwise. But that would just be an insult, given everything I've said up to this point would be just a meaningless waste of your time that I crafted purely for a gotcha. Game of Thrones could have had a giant pink unicorn show up, stab Daenerys with its horn, and then ride off into the sunset unexplained. But that wouldn't be accepted simply because it was unexpected. If you're going to subvert expectations, you have to ask yourself why you need to do that. To shock your audience is not enough of an answer. To shock your audience, and also to prove that characters don't have plot armor and actions lead to consequences in this world, that is enough of a reason. To shock your audience, and also deconstruct these overused tropes, that's also a good reason. But, unfortunately, at this point in the series, subverted expectations was the overused trope. Thanks for watching the video. Hopefully this won't be my last video on Game of Thrones Season 8, because I have more to say about it than I covered here, to the point where I think if I was going to outright review it, I'd actually have to split the review into 2 parts. I just have a lot to say about this. But what are your thoughts on it? Do you think there are shows or movies that did a worse job of trying to subvert expectations? Let me know down below. Like, share and subscribe and all that jazz, and I hope to speak to you again soon. Goodbye!